The static crackled through the radio frequency at 0900 hours on the morning of October 12, 1948. Captain Thomas Mantell's voice cut through the interference, steady at first, then edged with something that made the tower operators lean closer to their equipment. His aircraft was climbing through 20,000 feet when he transmitted words that would be replayed and analyzed for decades to come. "The object is directly ahead of me and slightly above," he reported, his breathing audible through the connection. "It appears metallic and of tremendous size." There was a pause, just long enough for the operators to exchange glances. Then his voice returned, quieter now, almost reverent. "It's moving through the cloud bank. I'm closing in to take a good look." Those were not the last words anyone heard from Captain Mantell, but what came next exists only in disputed transcripts and the memories of men who have since gone to their graves. Some say he described movement that defied the physics of any known aircraft. Others claim he spoke of something living, something that noticed him in return. What we know with certainty is that Captain Mantell never landed. His aircraft was found scattered across a Kentucky field, and the official explanation satisfied no one who had heard the confusion in those final transmissions. But this is not a story about Captain Mantell alone. His experience is merely the doorway into a disturbing question that hangs over humanity like the very clouds he disappeared into. What if the atmosphere above us, that vast ocean of air stretching 50 miles toward the edge of space, is not empty? What if we share it with forms of life that have existed long before we ever learned to build wings and engines? The sky accounts for 99% of the habitable space on this planet. We have named and cataloged the creatures of the land and sea, mapped their migrations, studied their behaviors. Yet the air above our heads remains largely unexplored, a three-dimensional wilderness where eyewitness accounts speak of things that should not exist. Across continents and centuries, separated by oceans and cultures that never made contact, people have reported encounters with entities in the clouds. Not aircraft, not weather phenomena, something else entirely. This investigation documents 5 distinct creatures, each reported multiple times by credible witnesses who had no knowledge of the other sighting. 5 forms of atmospheric life that challenge everything we think we know about biology and the limits of where life can exist. Each one more unsettling than the last. Each one suggesting that when we look up at an empty sky, we may be fundamentally wrong about what empty means. The evidence exists in pilot logs, in radar records that operators were told to forget, in the testimonies of meteorologists and astronomers who saw things during their night watches that made them question their own sanity. It exists in folklore far older than modern aviation, in stories told by mountain cultures and seafaring peoples who spent their lives closer to the sky than the rest of us. What you are about to hear will change the way you perceive the atmosphere. It will make you wonder about every cloud formation, every strange movement glimpsed at the edge of your vision when you look upward. Because once you understand what may be drifting in that unexplored ocean above, you will never look at the sky the same way again. The first creature waits in the records from 1952. But before we meet it, understand this. Each account becomes more difficult to dismiss, each entity more alien in nature. And by the time we reach the 5th and final creature, you will understand why some researchers have abandoned this field entirely, why certain files remain classified, and why perhaps some things in the sky are better left unobserved. The atmosphere keeps its secrets well, but secrets, when enough people stumble upon them, eventually demand to be told. The thin air, at 27,000 feet, does strange things to the human mind. Every mountaineer knows this truth intimately. Oxygen deprivation can conjure hallucinations, transform shadows into monsters, make the impossible seem real. But what Frank Smythe saw on Mount Everest in 1933 defied every rational explanation, even those offered by altitude sickness and exhaustion. Smythe was not a novice prone to panic or flights of fancy. By the time he joined the British Everest expedition of 1933, he had already established himself as one of the most accomplished climbers of his generation. He had conquered peaks across the Alps and the Himalayas, always maintaining meticulous records, always approaching his craft with scientific precision. His reputation for level-headed observation was beyond reproach among his peers in the mountaineering community. On that particular June afternoon, Smythe was climbing alone in the death zone, that region above 26,000 feet where human beings begin to die cell by cell by cell. He had separated from his climbing partner earlier that morning due to differing paces and the brutal demands of high-altitude ascent. The sky above the northeast ridge held that peculiar quality unique to extreme altitude, a darkness that seems to press down despite the brilliant sunlight, as if the edge of space itself looms just overhead. He stopped to rest on a narrow ledge, his breath coming in ragged gasps even through his oxygen apparatus. The clouds below formed a vast ocean of white, stretching to every horizon. And then he saw them, rising from the cloud banks like impossible sea serpents breaking through waves. Elongated shapes moved through the air. They were translucent, catching the light like living glass, their bodies undulating with a grace that seemed utterly wrong at such an altitude. Each creature measured perhaps 30 to 40 feet in length, ribbon-like and sinuous, moving not against the wind, but with some internal propulsion that allowed them to glide between cloud formations. Smythe watched, transfixed, as these entities wove through the air currents. They were semi-transparent, their bodies refracting sunlight in ways that created prismatic effects along their edges. He could see through them to the mountains beyond, yet they possessed substance, casting faint shadows on the clouds below. The way they moved reminded him of deep-sea creatures, jellyfish perhaps, or ribbon eels, but adapted to an aerial existence in the thin atmosphere of the highest places on Earth. His training as both a mountaineer and an amateur naturalist kicked in despite his shock. Smythe reached for his camera with trembling, frost-nipped fingers. The cold at that altitude makes even simple mechanical tasks nearly impossible, but he managed to advance the film and raise the viewfinder to his eye. He took 6 photographs in rapid succession, documenting the serpentine shapes as they glided through different positions against the cloud banks. The creatures seemed utterly oblivious to his presence, focused on something within the weather systems themselves. As he watched and photographed, Smythe noticed something else peculiar. Dark storm clouds were building to the east, and the ribbon-like entities appeared to be moving toward them with purposeful intent. Lightning flickered in the distance, and with each flash, the creatures seemed to shimmer more brightly, their translucent bodies pulsing with an inner luminescence. He had the distinct impression that they were somehow drawn to the electrical activity, perhaps even feeding on it in some incomprehensible way. The encounter lasted perhaps 15 minutes before the entities descended back into the cloud layer and vanished from sight. Smythe remained on his ledge, questioning his own sanity, wondering if the altitude had finally broken something in his perception. But the weight of the camera in his hands reminded him that he had evidence, proof that what he had witnessed was more than hallucination. When Smythe returned to base camp and eventually to England, he developed the photographs with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The images, though not perfectly clear due to the extreme distance and atmospheric conditions, showed exactly what he had seen. Elongated, serpentine shapes, translucent and otherworldly, suspended against the backdrop of Everest's cloud systems. He presented these photographs to the Royal Geographical Society, along with his detailed written account of the sighting. The response was immediate and dismissive. The Society, bastion of scientific respectability and guardian of British exploration's reputation, refused to acknowledge the photographs as evidence of anything unusual. Atmospheric phenomena, they declared. Ice crystals forming unusual patterns at extreme altitude. Lens flares caused by intense ultraviolet radiation at high elevation. Perhaps, they suggested with barely concealed condescension, the effects of oxygen deprivation on an otherwise reliable observer. The photographs were filed away, labeled as curiosities at best, fabrications at worst. But Smythe's account did not exist in isolation. When he shared his experience with the Tibetan porters and guides who had supported the expedition, their reaction was entirely different from the skepticism of the Royal Geographical Society. They did not express surprise or disbelief. Instead, they nodded with the calm recognition of those hearing about something already well known. The Tibetan monks from the monasteries surrounding Everest, those spiritual guardians who had watched the mountain for centuries, had extensive oral traditions regarding these entities. They called them sky nagas, celestial serpents that inhabited the upper atmosphere during certain seasons. According to the monks, these creatures had been observed for countless generations, particularly during the monsoon season when massive electrical storms swept across the Himalayas. One elderly monk from the Rongbuk monastery, the closest permanent settlement to Everest's north face, explained through a translator that the sky Nagas were considered sacred beings, neither benevolent nor malevolent, but simply part of the natural order at extreme altitudes. They appeared when the barriers between earth and sky grew thin, when lightning transformed the air into something more than mere atmosphere. The monks described the Nagas as creatures that existed partially in the physical world and partially in realms invisible to ordinary perception, feeding on the raw energy of storms, absorbing the electrical discharge that would otherwise dissipate unused into the thin air. These accounts stretched back through Tibetan oral history, carefully preserved through generations of monastery record-keeping. Monks who had spent years in high-altitude meditation retreats reported seeing the sky Nagas during particularly intense electrical storms. Shepherds who drove their yaks to high pastures spoke of witnessing ribbon-like entities dancing between lightning strikes. The descriptions remained remarkably consistent across centuries: translucent, serpentine, drawn to electrical activity, most commonly seen during monsoon season at altitudes above 20,000 feet. The monks explained that the sky Nagas were not considered supernatural in the Western sense, but rather part of the natural biodiversity of the extreme upper atmosphere, creatures as real as the snow leopards that hunted the lower slopes or the bar-headed geese that migrated over the Himalayan peaks. The difference was that these entities existed in an environment so hostile to human life that sustained observation was nearly impossible. Only those brave or foolish enough to venture into the death zone ever witnessed them directly. Smythe found these testimonies both validating and deeply unsettling. He expected his photographs to revolutionize scientific understanding of high-altitude phenomena. Instead, he found himself caught between Western scientific dismissal and Eastern spiritual acceptance of something that seemed to bridge both natural and supernatural categories. The photographs remained in relative obscurity for decades, occasionally mentioned in footnotes to Smythe's mountaineering achievements, but never seriously examined by the scientific establishment. Smythe himself died in 1949, still maintaining that what he had seen and photographed was real, still frustrated by the unwillingness of his peers to consider the possibility of undiscovered life forms in Earth's least accessible environments. For 86 years, Smythe's account remained a curious historical footnote, the sort of thing mentioned in books about mountaineering mysteries, but never investigated with serious scientific rigor. Until 2019, when multiple climbing teams on Everest reported encounters that matched Smythe's descriptions with eerie precision. During the spring climbing season of 2019, 3 separate expeditions reported witnessing translucent, ribbon-like entities moving through cloud formations at altitudes between 26 and 28,000 feet. The witnesses included climbers from Japan, Norway, and the United States, none of whom had prior knowledge of Smythe's 1933 account. Their descriptions were strikingly similar: serpentine shapes, semi-transparent bodies, lengths estimated between 25 and 40 feet, movement that suggested intentional navigation rather than passive drift in wind currents. Most significantly, 2 climbers managed to capture video footage on their summit cameras. The quality was poor, degraded by extreme cold and the limitations of equipment at such altitudes, but the footage showed exactly what Smythe had photographed nearly 90 years earlier. Elongated shapes, translucent against the clouds, moving with that same fluid, purposeful grace. And just as Smythe had noted, the creatures appeared during a period of intense electrical storm activity, seeming to orient themselves toward lightning strikes occurring in the distance. These 2019 accounts reignited interest in Smythe's original photographs and the Tibetan testimonies he had collected. Researchers began to wonder whether extreme high-altitude environments might harbor forms of life utterly unlike anything in the known biological catalog. The conditions above 25,000 feet are so extreme, so inimical to conventional life, that perhaps entirely different biological principles might apply. Could there exist creatures that fed directly on atmospheric electricity, that possessed bodies adapted to near-vacuum conditions and extreme temperature variation, that had evolved in an environment humans could only visit briefly before dying? The sky Nagas of Tibetan tradition might not be mythological after all. They might be the indigenous fauna of Earth's upper atmosphere, as real and natural as any creature dwelling in the oceans or forests, simply existing in a realm humans can barely access and survive in only with extensive technological support. Frank Smythe may have photographed not a hallucination or an optical illusion, but one of the last great undiscovered species on Earth, hiding in plain sight at the roof of the world. On the evening of September 4th, 1891, the quiet town of Crawfordsville, Indiana became the stage for one of the most bizarre mass sightings in American history. As darkness settled over the streets and farmland, something impossible appeared in the sky above the sleeping community, something that would shake the foundations of scientific understanding and leave witnesses questioning the very nature of reality itself. The first reports came just after 2 o'clock in the morning, when 2 ice delivery men, making their pre-dawn rounds, stopped their wagon in the middle of the street and stared upward in complete disbelief. What they witnessed hovering above them defied every category of known light. It was enormous, measuring approximately 18 feet in length, according to their estimates, and it moved through the air with the fluid grace of something swimming through water. But this was no bird, no balloon, no cloud formation catching the moonlight in unusual ways. This was something alive, something utterly alien to human experience. The creature, if that is indeed what it was, possessed no discernible head. Where one might expect to find eyes, or a mouth, or any feature recognizable as a face, there was only smooth, continuous flesh that seemed to pulse and undulate as the thing propelled itself through the night air. Instead, multiple eyes, described by witnesses as flaming or luminous, were scattered across its body, glowing with an intense red light that cast eerie shadows on the buildings below. These eyes, perhaps 6 or 8 of them according to various accounts, seemed to move independently, scanning the town beneath like searchlights sweeping across a darkened landscape. Most disturbing of all were the appendages that propelled this aerial nightmare. Witnesses described fin-like protrusions along its body, moving in coordinated waves that pushed the creature forward through the air, as if it were swimming through an invisible ocean suspended above the earth. The motion was smooth, deliberate, utterly unlike anything the good people of Crawfordsville had ever seen. Some compared it to the movement of a squid or jellyfish, though none of those comparisons could truly capture the horror and wonder of what they were witnessing. The ice delivery men stood frozen, watching this impossible thing drift slowly across the sky until it disappeared beyond the rooftops to the east. They looked at each other, confirming that they both had seen the same inexplicable vision, before rushing to wake their neighbors and report what they had witnessed. But they would not be the last to see the creature that night, nor would that be its only appearance over Crawfordsville. The following evening, September 5th, the creature returned. This time, far more witnesses were prepared. Their eyes turned skyward as word of the previous night's sighting had spread throughout the community like wildfire. Among those who witnessed the second appearance were Reverend G.W. Yee, Switzer, and his wife, whose testimony would become the most detailed and credible account of the entire incident. The Switzers were respected members of the community, pillars of moral and intellectual standing, whose word carried considerable weight. When they reported seeing the creature, it lent an air of legitimacy to what might otherwise have been dismissed as the hallucinations of tired working men or the exaggerations of attention seekers. The Reverend and his wife observed the phenomenon from their front porch for more than 20 minutes, giving them ample time to study its features and behavior in detail. According to Reverend Switzer's account, which was later published in the Indianapolis Journal, the creature appeared around 1 o'clock in the morning, materializing in the sky above their home with no warning or explanation. It hovered at first, suspended approximately 300 feet above the ground, its body writhing and contracting in what seemed to be either distress or perhaps simply the normal movements of something for which humanity had no reference point. The Reverend described the creature's skin as appearing almost white or pale gray in the moonlight, smooth and glistening as if wet. The flaming eyes, which he counted as 8 distinct points of light, rotated slowly across the surface of its body, their red glow intensifying and dimming in irregular patterns. Most unsettling was the sound it made, a low hissing or wheezing that carried clearly through the night air, suggesting respiratory distress or perhaps communication in a language no human could comprehend. Mrs. 1. Switzer, in her own statement, noted that the creature seemed to be surveying the town, its eyes focusing on different buildings and streets, as if searching for something or perhaps simply studying the human settlement below, with the same horrified fascination that the humans were directing upward. She described feeling an overwhelming sense of wrongness, as if they were witnessing something that had crossed over from a realm where the laws of nature operated according to entirely different principles. The creature remained visible for those 20 agonizing minutes, during which the Switzers called out to neighbors and passers-by, gathering a crowd of more than 100 witnesses who stood together in the street, watching this impossible thing swim through their sky. Then, just as mysteriously as it had appeared, it began to drift southward, its fins undulating in that characteristic swimming motion, until it faded from view beyond the horizon. The Indianapolis Journal sent a reporter to Crawfordsville immediately, sensing a story that would captivate readers across the state and beyond. The resulting article, published on September 7, 1891, treated the incident with surprising seriousness, detailing witness testimony and attempting to provide some rational explanation for what had occurred. The reporter interviewed dozens of townspeople, finding remarkable consistency in their descriptions, despite the inherent impossibility of what they were claiming to have seen. On the third night, September 6th, the creature returned once more. By this point, nearly the entire town was watching, hundreds of people standing in the streets and yards, eyes fixed on the heavens. The thing appeared again just after midnight, following roughly the same path across the sky as it had on previous nights. Witnesses reported that it seemed somehow diminished, its movements less fluid, its eyes less bright, as if whatever had brought it to Crawfordsville was releasing its hold, or perhaps as if the creature itself was weakening. Then, after that third appearance, it was gone. The night of September 7th brought no mysterious visitor, nor did September 8th or 9th or any night thereafter. Whatever the people of Crawfordsville had witnessed, whatever impossible thing had chosen their town as the site of its manifestation, had departed as mysteriously as it had arrived, leaving behind only memories and newspaper accounts that would puzzle researchers for generations to come. The mass hysteria theory, so often deployed to explain away collective sightings of unusual phenomena, struggles to account for several key aspects of the Crawfordsville incident. Mass hysteria typically spreads and intensifies over time, feeding on fear and suggestion until it reaches a fever pitch before gradually subsiding. But the Crawfordsville creature appeared on 3 consecutive nights, and then stopped completely. There was no gradual escalation, no lingering after effects, no copycat sightings in nearby towns, despite widespread newspaper coverage. The phenomenon had clear boundaries, a defined beginning and end that seems inconsistent with psychological contagion. Furthermore, the witnesses included people of varying social classes and educational backgrounds, from working-class laborers to educated clergy, all describing essentially the same thing. The details remained consistent across testimonies gathered independently, with no opportunity for witnesses to coordinate their stories. The creature was always described as headless, always approximately 18 feet long, always possessing multiple flaming eyes and fin-like appendages. These consistent details across diverse witnesses suggest something more substantial than shared delusion. What makes the Crawfordsville incident even more intriguing is that it was not an isolated occurrence. Throughout the late 1800s, similar sightings of what researchers have come to call sky jellyfish occurred across the American Midwest. In 1883, farmers near Sioux City, Iowa reported watching a translucent, pulsating mass drift over their fields for nearly an hour. In 1897, residents of Aurora, Texas claimed to have seen not just one but several such creatures swimming through the air in formation, moving with apparent purpose and coordination. These accounts share remarkable similarities despite occurring in different locations and years. Witnesses consistently describe creatures that seem to swim through the air, possessing no wings or visible means of propulsion beyond fin-like appendages or undulating body movements. They are often described as headless, or at least lacking any recognizable face, with eyes distributed across their bodies rather than concentrated in a single location. They appear at night, glow with their own light, and tend to hover over populated areas for extended periods before disappearing completely. Some researchers have speculated that these creatures might represent some unknown atmospheric life form, organisms that exist in the upper atmosphere where air density and atmospheric pressure create conditions unlike anything at ground level. Perhaps they occasionally descend to lower altitudes, entering the realm of human observation before returning to their natural habitat in the sky. This theory, while exotic, at least attempts to fit the observations into some framework of biological possibility. Others have suggested interdimensional origins, proposing that these creatures somehow cross over from parallel realities where the laws of physics permit aerial life forms of impossible design. According to this theory, certain locations or atmospheric conditions might create temporary windows between dimensions, allowing brief glimpses of ecosystems that exist alongside our own in spaces we cannot normally perceive. The people of Crawfordsville, Indiana, never received a definitive answer to what they witnessed during those 3 September nights in 1891. The creature never returned, and despite extensive searching, no physical evidence was ever found. No bodies, no shed skin, no physical traces of any kind remained to prove that something truly extraordinary had visited their town. All that remains are the newspaper accounts, the sworn testimonies of respected citizens, and the collective memory of hundreds of witnesses who saw something that should not exist swimming through the night sky above their homes, its flaming eyes scanning the world below before vanishing forever into the darkness from which it came. On a bitter cold morning in January of 1977, Dr. Constance Hillman stood before a blackboard covered in equations that would eventually cost her everything. The atmospheric physicist had spent the previous 18 months analyzing data that simply refused to obey the known laws of thermodynamics. What she had discovered in the upper reaches of our atmosphere would challenge not just meteorology, but our fundamental understanding of what shares the sky above us. Hillman was no fringe theorist. She had earned her doctorate from MIT in 1968 and spent nearly a decade at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, where her work on jet stream modeling had earned her widespread respect among her peers. She was methodical, cautious, and deeply skeptical of anything that couldn't be proven mathematically, which made what happened next all the more remarkable. It began with an anomaly in thermal satellite data from the lower stratosphere. Hillman had been studying heat distribution patterns at altitudes between 50,000 and 70,000 feet, trying to refine predictive models for extreme weather events. The data came from a new generation of infrared satellites that could detect temperature variations with unprecedented precision. Most of what she saw matched expectations perfectly. Cold air masses moved in predictable ways. Thermal gradients followed the laws of physics. Everything made sense until it didn't. In March of 1976, Hillman noticed something peculiar in readings taken over the Pacific Ocean west of Chile. A discrete thermal signature, roughly circular in shape and measuring approximately 200 feet in diameter, appeared to be moving against the prevailing wind. At first, she assumed it was an instrument error or a computational glitch. She ran the data through her algorithms again. The signature remained, defying explanation. Over the following weeks, she identified 17 similar signatures at various locations around the globe. Each one exhibited the same impossible behavior. They moved independently of wind patterns, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles in directions that violated every principle of atmospheric circulation. But what truly disturbed Hillman was the patterns of movement themselves. She began plotting the trajectories of these thermal anomalies on 3-dimensional maps, tracking their movements hour by hour, day by day. What emerged from her analysis was deeply unsettling. The signatures didn't drift randomly. They followed patterns that resembled search behavior. They would circle over specific geographic areas for hours, then suddenly accelerate toward other thermal signatures. When 2 signatures converged, the larger one would absorb the smaller, its heat profile intensifying, while the lesser signature vanished completely. Hillman spent months trying to find conventional explanations. Could these be some unknown atmospheric phenomenon? Somehow stable vortices of warm air that could maintain cohesion despite wind shear. She consulted with colleagues, carefully avoiding the implications of what her data suggested. None of the hypotheses held up to scrutiny. The signatures were too discrete, too mobile, too purposeful in their movements. By late 1976, Hillman had developed mathematical models that treated the signatures as if they were autonomous entities. She input variables for mass, energy consumption, and locomotion. The models worked. They predicted the movements of the thermal signatures with remarkable accuracy, but only when she programmed them to behave like living organisms engaged in predatory hunting behavior. The implications were staggering. Hillman was suggesting that massive creatures, potentially miles across, were living in the stratosphere, feeding on thermal energy. These organisms, if that's what they were, would be invisible to the naked eye, detectable only through their heat signatures. They existed in an environment where temperatures could drop to 70 degrees below zero, where atmospheric pressure was less than 1% of sea level, where nothing should be able to survive, let alone thrive. In February of 1977, Hillman presented her preliminary findings to a closed-door symposium at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. She was careful in her language, framing everything as unexplained anomalies that warranted further investigation. Even so, the reaction was swift and hostile. Senior scientists dismissed her work as fantasy. Others suggested she was suffering from exhaustion or seeing patterns where none existed. Her credibility, built over years of solid research, began to crumble in a matter of hours. But Hillman had allies. A handful of researchers had encountered similar anomalies in their own data and had quietly shelved them rather than risk professional ridicule. With their support, she continued her work, now operating outside official channels. She requisitioned weather balloon launches under the guise of standard atmospheric sampling. What she was really doing was hunting for physical evidence of the entities her models predicted. For 5 years, she found nothing. Dozens of balloons reached the stratosphere, took measurements, and returned data that showed only normal atmospheric conditions. Then came August of 1982. A high-altitude research balloon launched from White Sands, New Mexico, carried a battery of instruments to 63,000 feet. Among them was a recently developed low-light video camera, capable of functioning in the extreme cold and thin atmosphere. The balloon remained aloft for 7 hours, drifting eastward over Texas. When the payload was recovered, Hillman reviewed the footage personally. For 6 hours and 43 minutes, the camera recorded exactly what one would expect: the curve of the Earth, the blackness of space above, the pale blue shimmer of the atmosphere. Then, at timestamp 6 hours and 44 minutes, something entered the frame from below. The leaked footage, which would not surface until years later, shows what appears to be a membrane-like structure undulating through the thin air. The thing is translucent, almost invisible, but the camera's contrast enhancement reveals its outline. It has appendages, dozens of them, each one spanning what must be hundreds of feet based on the known altitude and distance calculations. They move with a rippling motion, like the fins of a manta ray, propelling the organism upward through the stratosphere. The entity approaches to within what appears to be less than 1,000 feet of the camera. For 47 seconds it fills the frame. Then it changes direction with impossible speed and vanishes into the darkness above. Analysis of the footage would later suggest the organism was over a quarter-mile across. Hillman knew what she had. She also knew what would happen if she went public. She made copies of the footage and secured them in multiple locations. She prepared a comprehensive report detailing 5 years of research, mathematical models, and now visual confirmation. She was ready to present her findings regardless of the consequences. She never got the chance. In September of 1982, Hillman's research funding was terminated without explanation. Her access to NOAA facilities and data was revoked. Colleagues stopped returning her calls. She was effectively exiled from the scientific community she had served for nearly 2 decades. Official explanations cited budget cuts and departmental restructuring, but the timing was unmistakable. Hillman refused to stop. If institutional science would not support her work, she would continue independently. She used personal savings to fund research trips, analyzing atmospheric conditions in areas where her models predicted high concentrations of the thermal entities. She became increasingly isolated, communicating only with a small circle of trusted colleagues who believed her work had merit. In June of 1984, Hillman traveled to the Atacama Desert in Chile. The region offered ideal conditions for her research. Clear skies, minimal atmospheric moisture, and high altitude provided excellent visibility of the upper atmosphere. She established a small field station in one of the most remote areas of the desert, equipped with thermal imaging equipment and spectrographic cameras. She maintained regular radio contact with her colleagues for the first 2 weeks. She reported promising thermal readings and planned to remain in the field for at least another month. Her last transmission came on the evening of June 23, 1984. She described unusual atmospheric conditions and mentioned that she was preparing to launch weather balloons at dawn. She sounded excited, almost euphoric. Those were the last words anyone heard from Constance Hillman. When she failed to check in the following day, colleagues alerted Chilean authorities. A search team reached her camp 4 days later. They found her equipment intact and still running. Her notes were neatly organized. Food and water supplies were largely untouched, but Hillman herself had vanished without a trace. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away from the camp, no indication of what had happened to her. The official investigation concluded that she had likely become disoriented and wandered into the desert, where the harsh conditions proved fatal. Her body was never recovered, but those who knew her rejected this explanation. Hillman was an experienced field researcher, meticulous in her safety protocols. She would not have simply wandered off into one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. Her final notes, recovered from the camp, contained observations that only deepened the mystery. She had detected massive thermal signatures directly above her position in the hours before her disappearance. She had written calculations suggesting the entities were descending, moving lower in the atmosphere than she had ever recorded before. Her last entry, written in hurried script, read simply, "They know I'm watching." The weather balloon footage from 1982 remained classified for years. When it finally leaked in the early 2000s, analysis by independent researchers confirmed what Hillman had claimed. The entity captured on camera could not be explained by any known atmospheric phenomenon. Its movements, its structure, its apparent purposefulness all suggested something living, something intelligent, something that should not exist but does. Today, Constance Hillman's research remains officially disregarded by mainstream science. Her papers have been buried in archives. Her models are dismissed as the work of a brilliant mind that succumbed to pattern recognition errors and confirmation bias. But there are those who continue her work in secret, tracking thermal anomalies in the stratosphere, searching for evidence of what she discovered. They find the same impossible signatures, the same predatory patterns, the same terrifying suggestion that we share our atmosphere with something vast and hungry that watches us from above. On the night of October 17, 2003, Captain Rebecca Betz pushed the throttle forward as Flight 722 lifted off from Logan International Airport in Boston, bound for Madrid. The Boeing 767 carried 231 passengers, most of them settling into their seats for what should have been a routine 7-hour journey across the Atlantic. First Officer Miguel Santos sat beside her, running through the post-takeoff checklist with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made this crossing dozens of times before. Neither of them could have imagined that within 3 hours, they would be radioing air traffic control with a report so disturbing that the Federal Aviation Administration would spend the next 2 decades trying to bury it. The first indication that something was wrong came at 2200 hours, when the aircraft was approximately 400 nautical miles east of Newfoundland, cruising at 37,000 feet over the black expanse of the North Atlantic. Rebecca noticed it first, a faint luminescence off the port side of the aircraft, visible through the cockpit windows. At first, she assumed it was another aircraft in the distance, perhaps catching moonlight at an odd angle. But as she watched, the glow intensified, and she realized with growing unease that whatever she was looking at was moving closer to them, matching their speed with impossible precision. Miguel saw it moments later. According to his initial statement, given to FAA investigators before he was pressured to change his story, the object appeared translucent at first, like a massive jellyfish suspended in the night sky. He estimated its size at roughly 3 football fields in length, though judging distances at altitude over open ocean is notoriously difficult. What made his blood run cold was not just the size of the thing, but the way it pulsated, expanding and contracting as if it were breathing, as if it were alive. Rebecca's hand moved to the radio. Her voice, captured on air traffic control recordings that were later classified but leaked to researchers in 2011, betrayed a tension that 20 years of commercial flying had never produced. She contacted Gander Oceanic Control, the facility responsible for managing North Atlantic air traffic, and reported an unidentified object pacing their aircraft. The controller's initial response was routine, asking her to clarify what she meant by object. Was it another aircraft? A weather balloon? His tone was professional, but tinged with the mild annoyance of someone expecting a simple explanation. Rebecca's response made it clear this was anything but simple. She described the translucent mass, the pulsating movement, the way it seemed to be keeping perfect pace with their aircraft, despite her attempts to alter speed and heading. Miguel had already increased their airspeed by 20 knots, but the object matched them effortlessly. When Rebecca banked slightly to starboard, the entity adjusted its position, maintaining what appeared to be a deliberate distance of approximately 200 meters off their port wing. Then the colors began. Witnesses in the cabin later described seeing the mass shift from a pale, ghostly white to deep azure blue, then to violet, then to shades of green that seemed to ripple across its surface like oil on water. The changes weren't gradual but sudden, pulsing waves of color that moved through the translucent body of the thing with hypnotic rhythm. Several passengers in the forward cabin had pressed their faces to the windows, initially curious, then increasingly frightened as they realized that what they were seeing defied every rational explanation. The air traffic control recordings from this period are particularly chilling. You can hear Rebecca's voice climbing in pitch as she describes the object beginning to change shape, the edges of the mass extending outward, forming what she described as appendages or tendrils. Miguel's voice breaks into the transmission, speaking rapidly in a mix of English and Spanish, urging Rebecca to request immediate clearance to descend and alter course. The controller, now audibly concerned himself, grants the request, but tells them that primary radar is showing an anomalous return in their vicinity, something solid and large that shouldn't be there. That radar data would later become one of the most contentious pieces of evidence in the entire incident. The FAA's official explanation would attribute everything the pilots and passengers saw to St. Elmo's fire, a weather phenomenon where luminous plasma is created by electrical discharge during thunderstorms. But St. Elmo's fire doesn't appear on primary radar as a solid object. It doesn't maintain formation with aircraft through course changes and speed adjustments. And it certainly doesn't do what happened next. At approximately 22:15 hours, passengers in rows 8 through 23, on the port side of the aircraft, began screaming. Flight attendant Jennifer Kowalski, who was in the forward galley preparing beverage service, rushed down the aisle to find dozens of passengers recoiling from their windows, some crying, others sitting in stunned silence. Those brave enough, or too shocked to move, remained at the windows, staring at what they would later describe in remarkably consistent terms. Tentacle-like appendages, translucent but definitely physical, pressed against the exterior of the cabin window. Passenger Thomas Brennan, a marine biologist from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, would later testify in a deposition that never made it to official FAA records that the appendages reminded him of cephalopod limbs, but scaled to impossible dimensions. He watched as what appeared to be suckers or some kind of sensory organs on the appendages pulsed against the window glass, leaving behind a viscous residue that caught the light from the cabin interior. He had the presence of mind to take out his phone and attempt to photograph what he was seeing, but the combination of window glare, darkness outside, and the translucent nature of the entity produced images too unclear to serve as definitive evidence. Multiple passengers reported the same residue on the windows, a substance that appeared silvery or opalescent in the cabin light. Flight attendant Kowalski confirmed seeing it herself, describing it as looking like the trail left by a slug or snail, but shimmering with colors that seemed to shift and change. She grabbed paper towels from the galley, intending to wipe it away or at least contain it, but by the time she returned to the windows, the substance had evaporated completely. Several passengers reported that in the seconds before it vanished, it seemed to absorb into the window glass itself, though this detail strains credibility and may have been a trick of lighting and traumatized perception. In the cockpit, Rebecca and Miguel were dealing with something even more disturbing. The entity had moved closer, now positioned directly alongside the aircraft at what Miguel estimated was less than 50 meters distance. At this range, they could see details in its structure, internal movements that suggested either complex anatomy, or perhaps some kind of energy pattern they lacked the framework to understand. Rebecca reported seeing what looked like veins or channels running through the translucent body, glowing with bioluminescent light that pulsed in rhythm with the entity's breathing motion. Miguel made the decision to inform the passengers. Against standard protocol, which typically advises keeping cabin announcements calm and vague during emergencies. He felt the people on board deserved to know that the pilots saw it too, that they weren't hallucinating or misinterpreting weather phenomena. His announcement, also recorded on the cockpit voice recorder, acknowledged that they were aware of the unusual phenomenon outside the aircraft, and were in contact with air traffic control to ensure the safety of everyone on board. His voice, despite obvious effort to remain calm, carried an undercurrent of fear that probably did more to terrify passengers than reassure them. The entity remained with them for another 17 minutes. During that time, Gander Control coordinated with multiple agencies, including NORAD, which confirmed the radar return and briefly scrambled fighters from Goose Bay and Labrador, though the jets would never reach the location before the incident concluded. Weather services confirmed there were no storms in the area, no atmospheric conditions that could produce St. Elmo's fire or any other known luminescent phenomena. Satellite data from that region and time, later reviewed by independent researchers, showed no cloud cover, no lightning, nothing that could explain what over 200 people were witnessing. Then, at 22:32 hours, the entity simply vanished. Not gradually, not by moving away at high speed, but instantaneously. One moment it was there, massive and undeniable, tentacles pressed against windows, captured on multiple radar systems. The next moment it was gone, as if it had never existed. Rebecca and Miguel both reported seeing a final pulse of brilliant white light, so intense they had to shield their eyes, and then nothing but the familiar darkness of the North Atlantic night. The remainder of the flight proceeded without incident. Flight 722 landed in Madrid on schedule, where it was immediately met by FAA investigators, FBI agents, and Spanish aviation authorities. Passengers were separated and interviewed individually. Flight attendants were sequestered, and Captain Rebecca Betz and First Officer Miguel Santos were informed that they were grounded pending psychological evaluation and a full investigation into the incident. What followed was a textbook case of institutional pressure and career-threatening coercion. Both pilots were subjected to intensive psychological screening, not to determine what they had seen, but to establish that they were mentally unfit to have interpreted it correctly. The evaluations focused on stress, fatigue, possible hallucination brought on by oxygen irregularities in the cockpit, anything that could cast doubt on their credibility. When both pilots passed these evaluations with no indication of mental instability, the pressure shifted to their employment status itself. Rebecca was informed by airline management that unless she agreed to sign a revised statement attributing the incident to misidentified weather phenomena and instrument anomalies, her position as captain would be terminated, and she would likely never fly commercially again. Miguel received similar pressure, complicated by his status as a naturalized citizen and veiled suggestions that his immigration status could somehow be called into question if he proved uncooperative. Both pilots, facing the destruction of their careers and livelihoods, eventually signed revised statements that contradicted everything they had reported during the incident itself. The AA's official explanation, released 6 months after the incident, attributed the visual phenomena to St. Elmo's fire, the radar returns to equipment malfunction and misinterpretation, and the passenger testimonies to mass hysteria triggered by the pilot's initial alarm. This explanation satisfied no one who examined it critically, but it became the official record, the version taught to aviation safety investigators and cited in textbooks on unusual atmospheric phenomena encountered during flight. But the evidence that contradicts this sanitized version continues to emerge. The leaked ATC recordings, available on various research websites, allow anyone to hear the genuine fear in Rebecca's voice, the urgency in Miguel's rapid-fire Spanish as he urges evasive action. The consistency of passenger testimonies gathered by independent researchers who tracked down and interviewed dozens of people who were on that flight reveals details that mass hysteria simply cannot explain. And the radar data, portions of which were leaked by a Gander Control employee who later lost his security clearance, clearly shows a solid return moving in formation, with Flight 722 performing maneuvers no weather phenomenon could achieve. Rebecca Betz left commercial aviation in 26. She now lives in rural Vermont and refuses most interview requests, though in a rare conversation with a documentary filmmaker in 2015, she stated simply that she knows what she saw, that she knows what was real. and that no amount of official denial will change those facts. Miguel Santos continued flying for several more years, but took early retirement in 2009. He has been more outspoken, participating in several conferences on unexplained aerial phenomena and maintaining that the official explanation is not just wrong, but a deliberate fabrication designed to protect institutions rather than reveal truth. For the passengers of Flight 722, the memory remains vivid. Many report that the experience fundamentally changed how they view reality, introducing into their understanding of the world the possibility that we share our skies with entities we cannot explain, cannot control, and can barely perceive. Some find this possibility terrifying. Others find it strangely comforting, a reminder that for all our technology and knowledge, mystery still exists, hanging in the darkness above the Atlantic, pulsating with colors we have no names for, touching our windows with appendages that leave no lasting trace except in the memories of those who witnessed them. The Relámpago del Catatumbo has illuminated the night sky over Lake Maracaibo for as long as human memory extends in this region of Venezuela. For nearly 160 nights each year, lightning dances across the heavens in a perpetual storm that has served as a navigational beacon for sailors and a source of wonder for generations. The phenomenon occurs where the Catatumbo River feeds into the lake, creating conditions that meteorologists have long explained through the meeting of cold Andes winds with warm Caribbean air, producing storms of such consistency that they can be predicted with remarkable accuracy. But in recent years, something else has been observed within these storms, something that defies conventional meteorological explanation and challenges our understanding of what constitutes life itself. Local fishermen were the first to notice the anomaly sometime around 2008. They reported cloud formations that behaved differently from the turbulent masses that typically roiled above the lake during the lightning storms. These particular clouds seemed to move with purpose, gliding through the air in smooth, deliberate motions that reminded observers of amoebas, viewed under a microscope. Most unsettling was their apparent relationship with the lightning itself. While the bolts struck all around them, illuminating the night in brilliant cascades of electricity, these specific cloud formations appeared to avoid direct strikes with movements that suggested awareness and intent. Documentary filmmaker Maria Santos arrived in the region in 2010, initially intending to capture footage of the famous eternal lightning for a nature series. What she witnessed instead would consume the next 5 years of her professional life. On her third night of filming, her cameras captured something extraordinary. A cloud mass, roughly the size of a small building, moved across the frame with smooth, flowing movements. As lightning struck around it, the formation would shift and undulate, seeming to position itself in the spaces between the electrical discharges. The movement was not random. It was deliberate, calculated, almost intelligent. Santos was not alone in her observations. Over the following months, 3 additional documentary crews arrived in the Catatumbo region, each initially skeptical of the reports. Canadian meteorological journalist David Chen brought high-speed cameras capable of capturing thousands of frames per second. His footage revealed details invisible to the naked eye. The cloud formations displayed what he described as predicted behavior, beginning to move away from areas where lightning would strike a full 2 to 3 seconds before the actual discharge occurred. This was impossible according to standard atmospheric physics. Clouds are collections of water droplets and ice crystals, moved by wind currents and pressure systems. They do not anticipate. They do not evade. They do not display awareness. Yet, the footage from multiple independent sources, captured over several years, showed consistency that could not be dismissed as coincidence or misidentification. The cloud entities, as researchers began calling them, exhibited behavior patterns that suggested not just reaction, but anticipation. They moved against prevailing winds, a phenomenon documented by weather monitoring stations in the region. On nights when winds blew steadily from the north at speeds exceeding 20 kilometers per hour, these formations moved south, east, or west, cutting across the air currents with apparent ease. The most disturbing aspect of their behavior, however, was what appeared to be coordinated action. Multiple entities would be observed moving in concert, their paths intersecting at specific points in the sky. When 2 of these cloud masses met, they would merge together, flowing into one another like drops of water combining on glass. The merged entity would then be larger, more substantial, moving with the same purposeful grace as its component parts. Even more remarkably, these entities could also divide. A single large formation would elongate, develop a narrowing point in its center, and then separate into two distinct masses that would drift apart and continue moving independently. This division and merging behavior caught the attention of Dr. Carlos Mendoza, a meteorologist with the Universidad Central de Venezuela who had spent 15 years studying atmospheric phenomena. Mendoza had built his reputation on rational evidence-based analysis. He was not given to speculation or sensationalism. When he first heard reports of the Catatumbo entities, he dismissed them as misidentified weather phenomena, possibly lenticular clouds or unusual variations of mammatus formations. But the accumulating video evidence troubled him enough that in 2015, he decided to investigate personally. Mendoza established a research station on the shore of Lake Maracaibo, equipping it with advanced meteorological instruments, radar systems, and multiple camera arrays. He intended to spend 3 months documenting the phenomenon and producing a paper that would provide a conventional explanation for what people were observing. Instead, he stayed for 3 years, and his conclusions would make him a controversial figure in the scientific community. According to Mendoza's carefully documented research, these entities demonstrated every characteristic of living organisms, except those we traditionally associate with biological life on Earth. They moved with purpose. They avoided danger. They consumed energy. They reproduced. They grew. They even, as would later be documented, died. The key to their existence, Mendoza theorized, was their relationship with the lightning itself. While they avoided direct strikes, his instruments detected that they positioned themselves in areas of high electrical field strength, the zones immediately surrounding lightning channels where electromagnetic energy saturates the atmosphere. Somehow, these entities were harvesting that energy, absorbing it into their structure and using it to maintain their coherence and fuel their movement. The composition of the entities remained largely mysterious. They appeared to be primarily water vapor and ice crystals, similar to ordinary clouds, but with some additional component that allowed for their unusual properties. Mendoza collected air samples from within and around the formations using weather balloons and small drones. Chemical analysis revealed trace amounts of complex organic compounds, including long-chain molecules that suggested biological origin. However, the concentrations were so low that contamination could not be ruled out, and peer reviewers would later cite this as a weakness in his research. Local residents, meanwhile, had their own theories. Miguel Torres, a fishing guide who had worked the waters of Lake Maracaibo for 40 years, claimed that his grandfather had spoken of the sky spirits, entities that fed on the storm's power and brought good fortune to those who respected them. Other locals insisted the formations were new, that they had only appeared in recent years, perhaps drawn to the region by the intensification of the lightning storms. The eternal lightning itself had become more active in the early 2000s, possibly due to climate changes affecting wind patterns and moisture levels. The incident that transformed the phenomenon from a curiosity into something far more unsettling occurred on the night of March 14, 2018. Multiple observers, including Mendoza's research team, witnessed what can only be described as the death of one of these entities. A cloud formation that had been tracked and photographed numerous times over the previous year, identified by its unusual elongated shape and consistent movement patterns, suddenly began to behave erratically. Its smooth, flowing movements became jerky and uncontrolled. It began to lose coherence, its edges becoming ragged and ill-defined. Then, over the course of approximately 20 minutes, the entity began to descend. It sank slowly through the air, its structure visibly deteriorating, portions of it wisping away like smoke. It landed in a marshy area near the town of Congo Mirador, and locals rushed to the site. What they found was unlike anything they had encountered before. Covering an area roughly 15 meters in diameter was a translucent, gelatinous substance. Witnesses described it as similar to jellyfish tissue, but with a faint, almost imperceptible luminescence. The material was cold to the touch and had an unusual texture, both slippery and slightly adhesive. Mendoza and his team arrived within 2 hours and collected samples, documenting everything with photographs and video. The substance defied easy categorization. It was primarily water, but contained the same complex organic molecules he had detected in his earlier air samples, now present in much higher concentrations. Under microscopic examination, the material showed no cellular structure, no DNA or RNA that could be detected with standard analysis. Yet it possessed a level of organization that suggested it had once been part of a coherent system, a larger whole that had maintained its structure through processes that remained unknown. Within 6 hours of falling to Earth, the substance began to dissolve. It did not evaporate or dry out, but seemed to break down at a molecular level, becoming first more liquid, then simply water, and finally disappearing entirely into the marsh soil. By morning, no trace remained except for the samples Mendoza had secured in sealed containers. Those samples, however, underwent the same deterioration process. Within 48 hours, despite refrigeration and isolation from atmospheric conditions, they had degraded into plain water, leaving no evidence of their former complexity. The implications of this event rippled through the small community of researchers studying the phenomenon. If these entities could die, it reinforced the hypothesis that they were indeed alive in some meaningful sense. But it also raised disturbing questions. What had killed this one? Was it age? Disease? Injury from lightning it failed to avoid? The entity had been observed and documented for at least 14 months before its death. How long did these things live? What was their life cycle? Mendoza became obsessed with answering these questions. His analysis of years of footage and observational data led him to a conclusion that would effectively end his academic career when he published it in 2019. He claimed that these were living organisms, a form of life that had evolved in Earth's atmosphere, possibly for thousands or even millions of years, undetected because they only became visible and coherent under the specific conditions present in the Catatumbo region. The intense, consistent lightning activity provided the energy source they needed to maintain their structure and become observable. Elsewhere in the world, they might exist in more diffuse, less organized forms, impossible to distinguish from ordinary atmospheric phenomena. The response from the scientific establishment was swift and harsh. Meteorologists pointed out the lack of rigorous chemical analysis and the absence of a plausible evolutionary pathway. Biologists noted that clouds, by definition, cannot be alive, that life requires certain baseline characteristics these entities did not possess. Mendoza's paper was rejected by mainstream journals, eventually appearing in a marginal publication known for pseudoscientific content. His university quietly suggested he take early retirement. The footage and data he had collected were dismissed as interesting but inconclusive, probably documenting unusual but ultimately conventional atmospheric dynamics. But the phenomenon continued, indifferent to academic skepticism, and it was changing. Systematic analysis of footage dating back to 2008 revealed a troubling pattern. The number of distinct entities observable in the Catatumbo region had increased dramatically. Early footage showed perhaps 5 to 7 separate formations on active nights. By 2015, that number had grown to 12 or 13. Current observations, as of 2022, regularly document 20 or more distinct entities moving through the storms on any given night. The increase represents approximately 40% growth in their population over a 12-year period. This suggests reproduction, the creation of new entities from existing ones. Whether this occurs through the division behavior that has been observed, or through some other process, remains unclear. What is clear is that their numbers are growing, and no one knows why or what it means. Are they simply expanding to fill available ecological space, their population growing until it reaches an equilibrium with available energy sources? Or is something else occurring, some change in conditions that favors their proliferation? The people who live beneath these eternal storms watch the skies now with a mixture of wonder and unease. What else might be living in our atmosphere, invisible or camouflaged against the everyday chaos of weather and cloud? What other forms of life might exist in environments we have always assumed were hostile to any organized living system? The entities of Catatumbo challenge our definitions, our certainties, our comfortable assumption that we know what life is and where it can exist. They drift through the lightning-torn skies, feeding on energy we cannot touch. reproducing through mechanisms we do not understand, existing in a realm that is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, ordinary and impossible. And with each passing year, there are more of them. October 23, 2015. 300 miles southwest of Mexico, the Pacific Ocean churned beneath skies that had turned the color of old bruises. Hurricane Patricia had already shattered records, her winds screaming at sustained speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour, with gusts measured at 230. She was the strongest hurricane ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere, a monster born from abnormally warm waters and atmospheric conditions that meteorologists described as near perfect for storm genesis. But what made Patricia truly extraordinary wasn't just her unprecedented power. It was what lived inside her. At 1400 hours local time, a specially modified WP-3D Orion aircraft lifted off from a NOAA base in Guadalajara. The mission was standard hurricane reconnaissance, the kind the agency had been conducting for decades. Fly into the storm, penetrate the eye wall, deploy dropsondes to measure pressure, temperature, and wind speed, gather data that would save lives through better forecasting. The crew consisted of 3 veterans: Major Sarah Chen, a meteorological officer with 12 years of hurricane flights under her belt; Lieutenant Commander Michael Torres, the flight engineer who'd flown into 47 named storms; and Captain Robert Weaver, the pilot, who'd been penetrating hurricanes since 21. Between them, they had over 6 decades of experience flying into nature's most violent phenomena. Nothing should have surprised them. Nothing should have made them question the fundamental nature of reality itself. But Hurricane Patricia was different. The Orion began its penetration run at 15,000 feet, descending through bands of torrential rain that hammered the fuselage like gravel against a tin roof. The aircraft bucked and shuddered as it encountered the outer rain bands, turbulence severe enough to slam unsecured equipment against bulkheads. Torres later reported that the usual pre-eye wall conditions felt wrong from the beginning. The wind shear patterns weren't matching the computer models. The pressure gradients seemed to pulse rather than hold steady. It was as if the storm was breathing. At 1432, the Orion punched through the eye wall into the calm center of Patricia. The transition from chaos to eerie stillness happened in seconds, as it always did. One moment, the aircraft was being thrown about by winds exceeding 190 miles per hour. The next, they were gliding through air so calm it felt like flying through a cathedral. The eye stretched 35 miles across, a cylinder of relative peace surrounded by towering walls of thunderstorms that rose to heights exceeding 50,000 feet. Chen immediately activated the thermal imaging system, a sophisticated array designed to measure temperature variations within the storm structure. The screen flickered to life, displaying the expected patterns: the warm core at the center, the cooler rain bands spiraling outward, the temperature differentials that drove the hurricane's heat engine. But then something appeared on the screen that made her breath catch in her throat. At the exact center of the eye, suspended at an altitude between 8,000 and 12,000 feet, hung a thermal signature unlike anything in the meteorological database. The central mass measured over 800 feet in diameter, roughly spherical, but with irregular protrusions that pulsed and shifted. From this central body extended what could only be described as appendages, vast limb-like structures that stretched outward in all directions, some reaching nearly to the eye wall itself. The thermal signature indicated the object was warmer than the surrounding air by approximately 15 degrees Celsius, and the heat distribution was wholly inconsistent with any atmospheric phenomena. Chen called out the anomaly. Weaver banked the aircraft for a closer pass, while Torres activated every imaging system on board: infrared thermal, standard optical cameras, even the experimental hyperspectral sensor they were field testing. Every single instrument confirmed what they were seeing. This was no instrument malfunction. This was no weather balloon or flock of birds or unusual cloud formation. Every sensor, working on different wavelengths and different principles, showed the same impossible thing. As they descended to 9,000 feet for a closer approach, the optical cameras captured what the thermal imaging had only hinted at. Through breaks in the thin clouds that always formed within a hurricane's eye, they saw it directly. The creature's skin, if that's what it was, appeared semi-translucent, with patterns of bioluminescence rippling across its surface in waves. The light pulsed in shades of deep blue and violet, and the rhythm of these pulses corresponded exactly with the fluctuations in atmospheric pressure that Torres was recording. When the creature brightened, the pressure dropped. When it dimmed, the pressure rose. The entity wasn't just inside the hurricane. It was controlling it, modulating its intensity with each pulse of light. The appendages defied easy description. They weren't tentacles, not quite, though that word came closest. They appeared to be composed of the same semi-solid material as the main body, but they moved through the air with purpose and precision. Some curled inward toward the central mass. Others extended outward, and Chen reported that these appeared to be interacting with the eye wall itself, as if manipulating the very structure of the storm. The largest appendage measured over 2 miles in length from the central body to its tip. For 18 minutes, they circled the entity, cameras rolling, instruments recording, all 3 crew members bearing witness to something that shattered every assumption about what lives in our atmosphere and what drives our weather. Weaver brought the Orion as close as he dared, approaching to within 800 yards of the central mass. At that proximity, all 3 crew members reported feeling a sensation they struggled to articulate. A pressure inside their skulls. A sense of vast intelligence regarding them with something like curiosity. Torres later described it as the feeling of being studied by something so far beyond human comprehension that the mere fact of its attention felt like a physical weight. The creature's bioluminescent patterns intensified as they drew near. The pulses came faster, and simultaneously, the barometric pressure at the storm's center began to drop even further. Patricia was strengthening, and this thing at her heart seemed to be the cause. Chen captured footage of one appendage extending fully to touch the inner eye wall, and at the moment of contact, the thermal cameras recorded a surge of energy, a transfer of heat that coincided with a measurable increase in wind speed in that exact quadrant of the storm. At 14:51, Mission Command ordered them to abort the run and return to base immediately. The official reason was deteriorating weather conditions, but the crew would later tell family members and close friends that the order came right after they transmitted the first thermal images. Someone on the ground had seen what they were seeing and made the decision to pull them out. The flight back was conducted in near silence. What could they say? What words existed to describe what they'd witnessed? They landed at 1600 hours, were immediately separated, and spent the next 6 hours in individual debriefings with personnel who identified themselves only as intelligence officers. All 3 were asked to sign non-disclosure agreements. All 3 were informed that their footage was classified under national security protocols. All 3 were told, in polite but unambiguous terms, that speaking about what they'd seen would result in criminal prosecution. The thermal imaging files, the infrared footage, the hyperspectral data, all of it was seized and classified. The official NOAA report on Hurricane Patricia made no mention of anomalies. It described a textbook reconnaissance flight of an exceptionally powerful but meteorologically conventional storm system that dead. But in 2019, something leaked. An anonymous user on an encrypted file-sharing platform uploaded 47 seconds of footage. The video quality was degraded, copied from a copy of a copy, but it was unmistakably authentic. It showed exactly what Chen, Torres, and Weaver had seen. The massive central body, the appendages extending through the eye, and most chilling of all, the bioluminescent patterns pulsing with rhythmic precision as the creature guided the storm beneath it. The footage went viral within conspiracy and anomalous phenomena communities before being systematically scrubbed from mainstream platforms within 72 hours. But by then, thousands had downloaded it. Enhanced versions appeared, with researchers attempting to measure the creature's dimensions and analyze the patterns of light. Some claimed the pulses formed a kind of code. Others insisted the movement of the appendages matched mathematical models of optimal storm intensification. The footage remains available on certain corners of the internet, dismissed by meteorological authorities as an elaborate hoax, but impossible to fully explain away. Then came the deaths. 4 months after the Patricia flight, Lieutenant Commander Michael Torres died in a single-car accident on a straight stretch of highway in clear weather. The police report stated he'd apparently fallen asleep at the wheel, despite having slept 9 hours the night before and driving in mid-afternoon. His vehicle left the road at high speed and struck a concrete barrier. He was 41 years old. 13 months after that, Captain Robert Weaver suffered sudden cardiac arrest while jogging in his neighborhood. He was 53, in excellent health, with no history of heart disease. The autopsy found massive myocardial infarction, cause undetermined. His wife told reporters that in the weeks before his death, he'd seemed anxious, looking over his shoulder, convinced he was being followed. She found his journal after he died. The last entry read, "They know I kept copies." Major Sarah Chen lasted the longest. She left NOAA 6 months after the Patricia flight, taking a position teaching meteorology at a small college in Oregon. By all accounts, she seemed to be rebuilding a quiet life, far from hurricanes and classified debriefings. Then, in August of 2018, she was found dead in her apartment from what the coroner ruled a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Her colleagues insisted suicide was impossible. She'd been making plans, excited about the upcoming semester, showing no signs of depression. But the ruling stood. The case was closed. 3 crew members. 3 deaths in the span of 34 months. The official position is that these were tragic coincidences, unrelated incidents that happened to involve people who'd once flown together. But in the small community of hurricane reconnaissance specialists, nobody believes in coincidences anymore. Nobody talks about Patricia. And nobody asks too many questions about what their instruments sometimes show them in the eyes of the most powerful storms. Because here's what the leaked documents suggest, what the classified files allegedly contain. Hurricane Patricia wasn't unique. Going back through historical data, analyzing thermal imaging from every Category 5 hurricane since 1950, researchers have identified similar anomalies. The signatures are there in Hurricane Camille in 1969, in Allen in 1980, in Gilbert in 1988, in Andrew in 1992, in Wilma, in Irma, in Dorian. Every storm that reached the highest category of intensity on the Saffir-Simpson scale has exhibited thermal irregularities at its core that don't match any known atmospheric phenomenon. The patterns are consistent. Central masses measuring between 400 and 1,200 feet in diameter. Appendage-like structures extending throughout the eye. Heat signatures that pulse in rhythm with pressure fluctuations. And in the few cases where optical imagery exists, reports of bioluminescence, of movement that suggests intention rather than random atmospheric dynamics. The question that keeps researchers awake at night isn't whether these entities exist. The evidence, fragmentary and suppressed though it may be, points towards something genuinely unknown inhabiting our most powerful storms. The question is what they are and what they want. Are they living creatures that feed on the immense energy of hurricanes? Are they somehow creating the storms themselves, generating these massive heat engines for purposes we can't fathom? Do they guide the paths hurricanes take, steering them toward coastlines or mercifully away? And perhaps most disturbing, are they aware of us? Did that thing inside Patricia recognize the Orion as a vessel containing thinking beings? Did it regard Chen, Torres, and Weaver with anything approaching consciousness? And if it did, what did it think of these small creatures who'd ventured into its domain? The official silence continues. The data remains classified. But the storms keep coming, each hurricane season bringing new Category 5 monsters that form in warm waters and intensify according to patterns that meteorologists can predict but never fully explain. And now, when hurricane hunters penetrate those eyes, when they descend into that eerie calm at the center of chaos, some of them wonder what's waiting there, suspended in the sky, pulsing with light, steering the winds that can erase cities from the map. We've examined 5 distinct types of entities inhabiting our sky. The rods, darting through the air at impossible speeds. The sky serpents, undulating through clouds like creatures born of myth. The atmospheric jellyfish, pulsing with bioluminescent rhythms. The shadow beings, darker than the darkness around them. And the translucent spheres, hovering with seeming intelligence and purpose. 5 categories of life that, according to conventional science, should not exist. But here's what makes the evidence truly disturbing. These sightings aren't relics of a superstitious past. They're increasing, dramatically. Witnesses report encounters that our grandparents never experienced, in places where the skies were once empty and familiar. The data from civilian researchers shows a pattern that mainstream institutions refuse to acknowledge. These entities are being observed more frequently than at any point in recorded history. Perhaps more unsettling, they're descending. Sightings that once occurred at altitudes of 30,000 feet now happen at 10,000, 5,000, sometimes just above the tree line. Campers in the Appalachian Mountains, pilots on commercial flights, farmers in the Midwest, all reporting the same inexplicable truth: something is coming closer. Which brings us to the questions that haunt every researcher who dares to investigate. The questions that receive only silence from academia and ridicule from those who claim to champion scientific inquiry. Are these creatures native to Earth's atmosphere, ancient inhabitants of a realm we've barely explored? Or did they arrive from somewhere else entirely, migrants from depths of space or dimensions we cannot perceive? Why do they congregate around electrical storms with such consistency? Why do thermal vents and atmospheric disturbances seem to draw them like moths to flame? And perhaps, most troubling of all, why the cover-ups? Why the witness intimidation? Why do those who speak too loudly about what they've seen find themselves visited by unmarked vehicles and men without credentials? We've explored less than 5% of our own atmosphere. Think about that the next time you look up at the clouds. Something might be looking back. What happens when they decide to come down? Damns. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.